Hi, this is Sandy Elliott. Thank you all for joining in. I'm so sorry for the slow start. We had a few technology issues, but we're going to proceed right along. I'm really happy that we are having the opportunity to give you some information about English learners and how you can support them in your classrooms. So we like to start each of our sessions with the department's vision and mission. And our vision is to create a world-class educational system that gives students the knowledge and skills to be successful in college and the workforce. And to me, the most important part of this is for them to flourish as parents and citizens. Our mission is to provide leadership through the development of policy and accountability systems so that all students are prepared to compete in the global community. So here you see our 6 State Board of Education goals, and what you'll know, I'm not going to go through and read each of them, but what you'll notice about each of them is that they talk about all schools, every child, every student. So that's really important to us, that we're really meeting the needs of all the students in all the different subgroups. And today that subgroup that we'll be talking specifically about is English learners. So today we're going to go through this stages of second language acquisition and understand some best practices for working with English learners, and then understand classroom accommodations and modifications for English learners. And then hopefully we're going to have time to also review some resources to support teachers of English learners. Okay, so we'll start off with the stages of second language acquisition. These are typical stages of second language acquisition. Some students will go through them at different rates, and some students will go through, might skip over some stages. Okay, so these are the stages of second language acquisition, and you should have received a handout, which I sent to your administrator, but I'm going to go through them. So the handout that you received should have the different stages, some instructional strategies for each stage, and some assessment strategies for each stage. So I'm just going to go through and give a brief description of each stage, and then I'll leave it to you to go through and look at the instructional strategies. So as I'm going through these stages, if you'll think about an English learner student that you have now or that you've had in the past who might fit into any of these categories. So that first stage is pre-production, and in the pre-production stage, these students have very little or no comprehension of English. They're really just learning survival English, and they may go through an actual silent period. It's not uncommon for EL students who are in this pre-production stage to go through a silent period where they say nothing. And we see this. I've had many teachers say, my EL student never says anything to me. They don't say anything to me. They don't say anything to any of their peers in the classroom, but their parents tell me that, in fact, they do talk at home. So we know that this is part of that stage of second language acquisition. And that silent period can last anywhere from a few hours to several months, and it varies depending on the student. In the early production stage, now these students have a little bit more English, and they can respond to us with 1 or 2 word responses. They use very simple vocabulary. Keep in mind, though, at each of these stages, even the pre-production stage, at each stage, the students really understand a lot more than they're able to express. These students at the early production stage have between 500 and 1,000 English words that they can use to communicate, and those communication that they exhibit for us are generally, 1 or 2 word responses, very limited. Okay, in the speech emergent stage, these students understand a lot more social English, but not much academic English. They can write simple and complex sentences. Still, remember, keep in mind that they are understanding more than they're able to verbally express. And at this stage, we're going to see also still some limitations on having difficulty with grade level reading, and content area vocabulary. So it'll be really important that we're explicit with teaching that vocabulary for them. Now, they have much more English that they can use and understand from the previous stage. Students at the speech emergent stage can have about 3,000 words that they can use and understand. So it's nearly tripled from the previous stage. So we see big leaps. And we see students move through these first stages quickly. In the early fluency stage, we call it early fluency or intermediate fluency. These students will be fluent in conversation. They can participate in classroom discussions. They talk with their English-speaking peers. Now, they may still have some difficulty with academic English, and their literacy skills may still be below that of native speakers, but they have really jumped up. They have doubled again in the number of words they can use and understand. They are up to about 6,000 words that they can use and understand. And at this stage, they become more willing to express their opinions as opposed to just giving us a simple response answer to what we have asked for them. So because they have more confidence, they're more willing to participate in other ways by giving opinions about things. Our final stage is the advanced fluency stage, and these students are very near to native speakers. Again, they may still have some difficulty with academic language, academic vocabulary, and they may still struggle with figurative language, although many of my English-speaking students, native English-speaking students, have struggled with figurative language. They're very close to performing like their native English-speaking peers, and they may still have an accent, but it shouldn't make their our ability to understand them any more difficult. So because of time, I'm not going to show this video, but I am going to send you this PowerPoint so you'll be able to reference it, and I will send a link to this video which shows students, EL students, in each of these stages. So it'll really help you get a better idea of what the stages sound like. So there are many factors that can affect that rate of language, second language acquisition. Chronological age is one of them. We think of 8 to 12 as that ideal age. They have a strong vocabulary and language base in their first language, so they're able to use that base to help them to learn a second language. And of course, their raw intellectual and linguistic abilities are also factors. Also, the personality of the learner. Those introverted students may develop oral language later, but their written language may come along more quickly. Their self-motivation is a big factor. I had a student who came to me one year. I was teaching 6th grade. She had no English when she walked in the classroom door, but it was really important for her because her father said to her, if you learn English well enough by the end of the school year, we'll go to Disney. So she was highly motivated by that, and every time I turned around, she was pushing herself to learn new words and asking other students how to pronounce words. So that self-motivation is a big factor. And also a student's willingness to take risks. It is a factor. Those students who are more willing to take risks are going to try language a little more freely, and are probably going to pick up on the language a little bit quicker. There are also environmental factors. The importance the family places on English, the amount of English spoken at home. If you think of many of our English learners, the only place they're hearing English is when they're at school with us or on the bus with other students who speak English. So that can be a factor. And also whether or not the student is engaged in the broader English-speaking community. So it's really important that we want to make sure we get them involved in clubs or after-school sports programs or other community activities that may help to get them, give them more opportunities to practice their English. Also, as we said before, the native language development. Students with that strong foundation in their native language tend to excel, and the characteristics of the native language. Languages like Spanish and French have a very nearly identical alphabet and numeric system, so that's going to be easier for the students to pick up on, while languages like Arabic and Mandarin, the writing is very different. They even read from, like Arabic, they read from right to left. So it's a very different language set of skills that they have to learn. So that may affect the rate of second language acquisition. Okay, so let's think about those. And when we're in the classroom with students, we think, okay, well, it's great for us to know these stages of second language acquisition, and I think I can identify probably what stage my students are in. But then the question is, how do we assess them? How do we question them so that we can find out what information they know? So, for example, for the students who are in that pre-production stage, that very beginning stage, we might do things like we might ask them things. If we want to know, say, for example, we read the story of the Three Little Pigs. We'll use that as our story. It's a universal story that everybody knows. We can ask them by having them point at pictures in a book and say things like, can you show me the wolf? Where is the house? Who was the bad guy in the book? So again, these are things the students might not be able to verbalize to us, but they can definitely understand what we mean, and they can point to us so they can demonstrate their knowledge. Those students who are at that early production stage, who had those 1 or 2 word responses, so we can ask them questions that rely upon what they can do. So we can ask them yes or no questions, either or questions, or even something like, who blew down the straw house? They could very simply answer us that by saying the wolf. So you see how we can ask questions that at this stage are still pushing them in their zone of proximal development to give us the information that they're able to give, but at the stage that they're able to give it, not pushing them to do something that would be out of their language range at this time. When we move into the speech emergent stage, remember, at this stage, the students understand a lot more social English, and they can write those simple and complex sentences. So we can ask them longer questions about why and how, like, why didn't the brick house fall down? Or how many houses did the wolf blow down? So we're asking them, we're pushing them to give us a little bit more for each stage that they're at. In the intermediate fluency, we can now ask, remember, these students have much stronger grasp of English. They're fluent in conversation. So we can ask things like, what would happen if the pigs outsmarted the wolf? So not only do they show us that they know the story, but they can think outside of the story, and they can respond to what they're thinking outside of the story. So these are questions that require more than a sentence response. So in our classroom examples for the advanced fluency stage, so we can ask them to give us more, to retell the whole story to us, or retell the main ideas of the story, including the plot elements, but leaving out the unnecessary details. So these are much higher order thinking, and we're able to get that from them because their vocabulary is there. Okay, so next we're going to move on to some best practices to support English learners in your classroom. Okay, so when in doubt, make it visual. That's really a big key for English learners. You know, they say a picture paints 1,000 words, and for our English learners, it's really going to cut down on frustration and help them to feel more independent. So we can do things like providing a visual schedule, and the visual schedule that you see here on the screen is actually one that you can get from our webpage. It is downloadable. It is a Word document. You can insert your own times, your own pictures. You could have, even if you're departmentalized, say in, maybe 5th or 6th grade, if you're departmentalized, you can put in not only a picture related to the subject, like say math, where you have math figures, but you could also put the picture of the math teacher just to help the student remember. Now, this visual schedule can be one that individual students carry around, or it can be a longer one that you post in your classroom. Note that we not only have the visual part, we have the meaningful picture, but we also have the time, and we have the name of the subject where the student will be going. We can use visual anchor charts, visual word walls, and note, like on the word wall on this example, we see the letters, but there is not a picture associated with the letter. There's a picture associated with each individual word. And that's really important because we want students to construe meaning from the words. And those visuals will be great reminders for them. By the way, when you're doing all of this stuff, providing these visual supports, that's not going to just help your English learners. That's going to help all your students who struggle with standard English or who struggle with remembering how to spell or what's coming next. There are also classroom labels, so notice the classroom labels here not only show the word, but they show a picture to go with it so that there's no confusion about what the word represents. So here's an example of an anchor chart with visuals, and it's for a morning routine. So I would use these regularly for my students. Notice I have what they would have to do in the morning. They're going to unpack their backpack. I have a picture of a backpack. They're going to go to breakfast. I have a picture of what that looks like. So with each thing that I want them to do, I've got the words and the picture because I want them to make those connections between the words and the pictures. I will tell you I've used this, though, even for students who are not English learners. Many times in the morning, I would be working, with different students, and I'd see a student who seemed to not know what he or she was supposed to be doing, and I'd say, what are we supposed to be doing? And they'd say, I don't know. And I'd say, really? It's the 10th week of school. You don't know what we're supposed to be doing? No, I promise you, Miss Elliott, I don't remember. Can you just tell me? When I started using these kind of visual anchor charts to remind students, not only did it cut down on frustration for them, it actually cut down on frustration for me too, because I could just say, hey, look at the morning routine, and they'll remember, and they would. So it really made a big difference for my students. Okay, some other best practices. Speak slower, not louder. They can hear you. They just really need you to slow it down because those of you who have ever watched a foreign language movie without the subtitles or listened to somebody speak in another language will know and remember that what you're doing is you're listening very intently for the words that you understand. So that's what our EL students are doing. They're listening very intensely to you to understand what you're saying. Speak distinctly. That's a big thing for us here in the South. We really need to make sure that we are enunciating our words carefully. We tend to do things like drop off endings. I know I tend to drop off endings and say things like I would say, typically I'd say something like, okay, no playing around in the bathroom. Well, that playing, they know what I mean, but if I'm teaching that ing sound, they might not make the connection between playing with that ing and the word playing that they hear me say. So that's really an important thing for us to do. Give longer wait times. Just remember, they're thinking in two languages. A native speaker will hear what you're saying. Say you pose a question. They'll hear the question, they'll think of a response, and then they're ready to answer. 3 simple steps. An English learner hears your question, tries to select vocabulary that they understand from your question, translates that to their first language, thinks of a response, translate the response back into English, and then they're ready to answer you. So it's going to take them more time. So just give that longer wait time. By the way, this is, again, going to help everybody in your class. All of those kids that maybe just need a little bit longer to process a question, it's going to make a difference for them. Allowing students to write out answers before speaking, that's going to make a huge difference. I actually started doing this when I had students with dyslexia because I knew they had an issue with processing and it was just going to take a little bit longer. So I allowed everybody that time to write out an answer. And of course, my little smarty pants kids would say, I don't need to write it out, Miss Elliott, I already know. And I'd say, that's okay, that's fine, you don't have to write it out, but I'm giving everybody that opportunity to. Once I started doing that, it really helped all of my students because I got much more participation from a varied group of students, and it allowed them to think about their answers carefully. Excuse me. Okay, so we also want to refrain from allowing shout-outs when asking whole group or small group questions. Now, I know what happens. Sometimes kids get very engaged and they want to call out answers, and that's great. We love them to be engaged, but we really want to make sure that if that happens, we want to make sure for everyone's sake that we reply with the correct response, because I may even be working in a small group with students and say I have 4 kids at a table and I pose a question, 2 of them give a response, 1 of them who didn't respond is an English learner, but my 2 who gave a correct response said it in a different way. Well, that may be confusing for an English learner who's still trying to pick up on every word that's said to gain meaning. So if we can just repeat the correct answer when those instances happen, that'll be great. Writing down key terms and using visuals with those key terms, that's really important for all of our students, especially our English learners. They'll get the idea of what are the important words and what's the meaning for that important word. So when I first started teaching, that was an issue for me because that was back in the dark ages. And we didn't, if I wanted a picture of something, I was either finding it in a magazine and cutting it out, or I was getting a friend to draw it for me. Now we're so fortunate. We've got all kinds of media available for us. In my last few years of teaching, I was using PowerPoints all the time for vocabulary. I would get the word, and we would have a visual, and we would create meanings together, or sometimes I'd give them the specific one. Either way, that visual made a huge difference for my EL students and all my other students. We want to use scaffolding techniques to support learning whenever possible. And really a very big point is that we want to incorporate conversation into all aspects of our teaching. We can do this through 30-second conversations. We can do it through turn and talk or think, pair, share. It's super important that we incorporate this strategy because I promise you, if we don't provide our students opportunities to practice the new vocabulary and the new concepts that we are teaching in our classroom, they are probably not getting on the bus and talking about it. So we really want to make sure that we provide those scheduled opportunities for students to participate in conversation around our academic language. Okay, so here's an example of a 30-second conversation. Now, I love 30-second conversations because they're really nothing I have to plan for. It's nothing I have to put in my lesson plan book. It's something that really helps me to build rapport with my students and to help me model language for them. So here's an example of a teacher speaking to Kelly. So the teacher says, "Hi, Kelly, did you have a good night?" Kelly says, "Good morning, yes." So Kelly seems like she's about done. She's not giving us a lot of information yet, but the teacher doesn't let her go. She probes on and she says, "I'm so glad. What did you hear after you finished what did you do after you finished your homework?" Kelly says, "I helped cook." Teacher says, "Who did you help cook?" Kelly says, "I helped me mom and me grandma." Now notice that Kelly's grammar is not 100% perfect in these two, but she's already giving us sentences as opposed to the one or two words she gave in the first part. But the teacher's now modeling. Listen to how she says it. She says, I always loved helping my grandma cook. What did you make? So without correcting Kelly, she has modeled for her correct use. Kelly says, we cook arroz con pollo and maduros. I help fry the plantains. And the teacher asks, which was your favorite thing to eat? Kelly says, I like maduros. They have a good sauce. It is with garlic and orange juice. It is good. So note, look at the beginning. So in the beginning, Kelly's first response was 3 words. By the end, she's here with 4 sentences. They're not 100% perfect, but look at how much in just that 30 seconds that teacher has brought her along. So that's one of the reasons why I love 30-second conversations. They're easy to do, and there's something that I really didn't realize that I was even really doing correctly. We all do it. We stand at our door in the morning to greet kids as they come in, and I know partly why we're doing it is to make sure that nothing wild is going on in the hallway. But all my kids always had something to say to me, and so this was a great way for a teacher to model language, to learn about your kids, build that rapport with them and that relationship with them so that they'll be more willing to share with you. And it's also a low-risk opportunity for students to participate in the practice of language. Okay, so let's go on and talk about accommodations and modifications. Now note, when we talk about accommodations and modifications in this section, we are talking about classroom accommodations and modifications. Okay, so it really can impact our EL students significantly. Keep in mind, accommodations don't change the actual content being delivered. These are tools that help us to allow students to demonstrate what they know without lessening their expectations. So the standard is still the same. We're just going to use some tools to help them to demonstrate that better. Modifications, however, are different. These are changes that are actually made to the core content so that the learning objectives are different and more accessible for the student. Keep in mind, all state testing accommodations are considered classroom accommodations. However, not all classroom accommodations are considered state testing accommodations. So, on the language service plan, which you have for each of your students, you will see a page. On the first page, it actually shows what those state testing accommodations are. So we need to be doing those state testing accommodations in our classroom on a regular basis, because if we're not, we're actually not allowed to use them for our students on the state test. Also, it's really not going to do them any good. Let's say a student has extended time and they've never been using extended time, they're not going to take advantage of that during the state test. If they're allowed to use a word-to-word glossary that shows the word in English and then the word in their language, but they've never used one in our classroom, they're not going to know how to use it. So it's not going to do them much good, besides the fact that we won't be allowed to use it. There are also, I think it's on the 3rd page of the language service plan, there are classroom accommodations. There's a list of them. And those are, many of them, they're not classroom, a lot of those classroom accommodations are not allowable on the state assessment. So there's things like work with a peer buddy. Clearly that's going to be something that's not going to be allowed on the state assessment. So we want to make sure we're keeping those 2 kinds of accommodations separated so that we know the difference. Okay, so here's some examples of classroom accommodations. Alternate responses, so that's things like using multiple choice instead of a written out sentence response. Same question, same content, just an alternate way of responding. Advanced notes, so that's just going to help students get the gist of the lesson without having to worry about every little vocabulary word that we're stating. Extended time, remember they're thinking in 2 languages, they need a little bit longer time. that teacher modeling, that's things like using gestures, it's things like, for example, when I would teach writing, say I was teaching persuasive writing, when I had a new concept I was teaching, I made sure I had the example on my smartboard or on my document camera so that all students could see it, and we would label it. What are these different things? What am I using? Here's your introduction. These are your supporting details. Here's the concluding paragraph. So we would model in that way. So there are a lot of different ways to model. Simplified written and verbal directions, so that's just going to cut down on confusions. But I know that you're probably doing what many of us teachers do, and that is you're trying to model your classroom assessments after what the students will see on the state assessment. So one of the things that I would do is I would provide that direction the way it would have been written on the state assessment. But then with my EL students, I would go through and highlight at the beginning of the year, these are the important words. So I knew that they knew exactly what the gist of the question was. As we progressed through the year, my goal was to get them to be the ones to highlight, and I'd check it. Some of my students, depending on their stage of second language acquisition, by the end of the year, they didn't even need me to highlight. They would just say, oh, I've got it. Don't worry about it, Mrs. Elliott. So we want to make those accommodations, but we want to do it based on the student's level as well. Frequent breaks, they're just, you know, they're using a lot of brain power to think in two languages. Again, the use of dictionaries and glossaries. Okay, okay, so the modifications, remember, those are those changes to the core content. So those are typically going to be implemented when they're written on the language service plan or an individualized educational plan. Really, what we want to do as teachers is we want to try as many accommodations as possible, because if we keep modifying, we want to make sure that they are still getting access to the grade level standards and content so that they're able to, by the time they get to high school, they have all the background they need to be able to meet graduation requirements. That's really important. So again, we want to maintain instruction for the standard or skill. There may be times when we need to modify the reading material level in order for the students to be able to access the content information. Whatever we do with accommodations and modifications, we need to make sure that we document all the accommodations and modifications that we use, as well as the results, because we may find that there are some accommodations that we have written on a language service plan that students no longer need. So we want to make sure that we're taking them out as needed or as not needed. Okay, so here's an example of an accommodation or modification. I'm going to let you think about it. Oh, I see our time is getting really short. So I'll go through, I'm going to go through and skip this. So I just want to show you some of the resources that we have for you on our MDE site. So you can go to our English Learner site. So to get there on the Educators tab, you just click on that, and then you'll see English Learners. They're written in alphabetical order, so you'll see English Learner Support. So here's some of the things that may be of interest to you. We have a family welcome sheet, some sentence stem cards, and some communication cards for elementary students. You can just print those out, put them on an O-ring to help students to be able to understand better. We also have these literacy tips of the month that we did last year. Oops, sorry about that. So those are all available for you to view and to use. We have our family guides for student success, both in English and in Spanish. So you can find that on our intervention services page. You can also find resources on our literacy page. We try to put things all over the place. So wherever you're used to going, you're going to find supports for English learners. We do have new English learner guidelines that came out last May. We have a plethora of supports in here for you. The ones that I think teachers are especially interested are these instructional strategies. those actually have instructional strategies from pre-K to 12th grade that can help support students of teachers who are supporting English learners. A lot of information for you in there. Again, some of the information on our Newcomer Kit. And I want to get here, I have some apps for English learners that are available for you. We don't endorse any products at the Mississippi Department of Education. However, we like to tell you about free stuff that's available because we know how much you're already spending on your classroom. So these are there. I'm going to make sure that you get a copy of this PowerPoint. And I really, really mean this when I say this, and that is, if you need anything, please contact us. We are here to support you in any way that we can. You can email us, you can give us a phone call, whatever works for you. We're really here for you. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that this has been helpful for you, and you'll contact me if you need anything. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Have a great day.